Hello everyone, thank you for being there. Malcolm Noble welcoming you to the series of podcasts about the history of English detective fiction. And this evening we're going to be talking about the writers from the Donnish School. The History of English Detective Fiction is a fortnightly podcast tracing the genre from 1920 until the proliferation of post-war television, let's say 1960. It won't be an A to Z gazetteer, nor a strict chronology, but will bounce around different subjects of interest. Please don't forget to rate it on your listening platform, and I hope you enjoy tonight's podcast. Now, as soon as you put authors into groups, you immediately invite an argument about who's in and who is out. And I have to say that we've had many such debates in my bookshop as I've been putting this talk together. But I think there are four essential elements to the definition of the Donnish School. For a start, the author or his character must have links to Oxford or Cambridge University. That intellect must not only be evident in the narrative, it must be paraded. It needs to be delivered with wit. The book needs to be witty. And the author needs to poke fun at either himself, his detective, or the genre. So there is an element of self-parody. Now, what the Donnish School showed was that detective fiction was not only acceptable to the literary middle classes, we knew that from the beginning, but it was also enjoyed by intellectual academics. They enjoyed the analysis and the puzzle. Not only that, they wanted to have a go themselves. They wanted to write detective stories. But furthermore, they wanted to improve the genre. Not by developing it into a different type of novel. Certainly they didn't want to write crime novels, but they did want to deliver first-rate detective stories. Stories that did not rely on luck or coincidence, in which the clues were presented fairly and timely, and the solution made sense but was concealed until the end. And most of all, they wanted the books to be readable. They wanted it to be fun, and that is where the self-parody came in. Pretty soon, people were talking about the perfect detective novel. Could all those elements be delivered without one overshadowing the others? It became a goal rather like proving a difficult theorem. And so people began to talk about mystery novels being crafted, and that element of craftsmanship really took English detective fiction to its highest level. So what do you get when you buy a Donnish detective novel? You're going to get analysis, hypothesis and experimentation, a proper investigative cycle that is very evident in some of the books. You're also going to get Latin and Greek, literary quotations, literary allusions, and maybe a stodgy old theologian, although we shouldn't confuse this school with the clerical collar school. That's the subject for another talk at another time. H.R.F. Keating, when he was speaking about the novelist Edmund Crispin, said, "You have to be bright to get the most out of this author." Well, that is true, but whether you keep up or not, you're going to enjoy a good, fun read. You're listening to the third episode in a series of podcasts about the history of English detective fiction. My name is Malcolm Noble, and this evening I'm talking about the Donnish School of detective writing. I want to begin by talking about Michael Innes. He was described by H.R.F. Keating as the most Donnish of the Donnish School, and many would say that at his best he was the best. He was born in 1906 in Scotland and attended Edinburgh Academy before going up to Oriel College, Oxford, where he excelled. By 1930 he was teaching at Leeds University, where he met his future wife. But in 1934 he decided to accept a post as Professor of English Literature at Adelaide University, and it was during his voyage to Australia that he wrote his first detective story, Death at the President's Lodgings. It is a murder story set in a fictitious college, St Anthony's College, in Oxford. And we meet, for the first time, Inspector John Appleby. And throughout the series we will follow Appleby's career, all the way to Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police and even into retirement. Innes's books are highly regarded. Many would say that Hamlet's Revenge, written in 1937, was one of his best, while others would go for Journeying Boy from 1949. But there are many others that could be put forward as his best book. Myself, I like Appleby's End, where the detective meets his future wife, and it's his wife's family that provides the treasure chest of eccentrics and weird characters that are so much of a delight in Michael Innes's books. Michael Innes was the pseudonym for J.I.M. Stewart, who was a very successful general novelist as well as a biographer, and he certainly regarded his detective fiction as his secondary work. But his contemporary, Nicholas Blake, who started out with A Question of Proof in 1936, never deprecated his crime fiction, even though he eventually became the Poet Laureate, C.D. Lewis. Blake's detective was Nigel Strangeways, loosely based on W.H. Auden, although that similarity is not so apparent as the series progressed. And in the 1940s and 50s, Strangeways was seen as one of the strongest and most considered characters in English detective fiction. The third stalwart of the Donnish School of English detective fiction was born in 1921, and as Bruce Montgomery went to St John's College, Oxford, where he was friends with Philip Larkin and Kingsley Amis. He was a successful and noted composer and, to a lesser extent, musician. To say that he wrote the score of the British film comedy Carry On Nurse is probably not his best tribute, but it does signify his commercial success. Edmund Crispin wrote his first detective story in 1944 and delivered one a year until 1951, when for some reason he took a break for almost a decade. 50 years later, first editions of his novels are sought after as classics of the crime fiction genre. He created the fictional detective Gustav Fenn, a person that it is almost impossible to describe, though the crime writer Susan Moody probably came closest when she said that Fenn was evidence that Richmal Crompton's Joss William never really grew up. Fenn wears coats that are too big for him, hats that are enormous and outrageous. His hair is either plastered down with water or sticking up on end, or both. He has a plain, ordinary, bespectacled wife who he loves just as much as his colourful roadster. Don't forget, H.R.F. Keating has already warned us that we need to be bright if we're going to keep up with his literary and classical references, but the books are really good because of their labyrinthine, if slightly unlikely, puzzles. Everyone mentions The Moving Toy Shop, and although this isn't his best book, it is certainly his most memorable. And who's to say that it could not have really happened? It is difficult to say in any straightforward way that the Donnish School of English detective fiction was truly a success. In the Encyclopedia of Mystery and Detection, edited by Steinbruder and Penzler, their article on Michael Innes concludes, "What had once been a successful attempt to fuse satire with the mystery novel had deteriorated into strained attempts at humour. I agree with them, and it has to be said that not only Michael Innes, but the other writers that I've mentioned did tail off towards the end. They produced readable, fun, and creditable detective novels, but somehow that doesn't seem enough. Their true contribution to the development of the detective story was to show that it had potential beyond the boundaries of popular fiction. Perhaps Innes, Blake and Crispin pushed that forward but somehow ran out of steam, and it seems that their successors have never really picked up the gauntlet. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to this talk on the Donnish School of English Detective Fiction. This was the third podcast in a series that looks at the development of the genre from 1920 to 1960. This episode was uploaded on the 20th of November, and the next episode will be published on the 4th of December. I hope that you'll be there to catch it. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Malcolm Noble. My website is malcolmnoble.com. I hope you'll take a look at it. All that remains is for me to say good night and God bless. And of course, thanks to YouTube for the royalty-free audio.